Usually when we talk about the virtues that literally built human civilization, things like physical courage, rapid risk-taking, or, I don't know, an almost irrational stoicism in the face of just absolute danger, there is this unstated expectation of universal respect.
Right. Yeah, it feels straightforward.
Exactly. It feels
Yeah.
straightforward. Like you see a burning building, someone rushes into the flames to pull out a stranger, and society as a whole points to that person and says, that is a hero. I mean, it's the narrative that has driven human survival since we were, hunting mastodons.
It is arguably the foundational human narrative. It's clean, it's binary, and for the vast majority of our history as a species, it has been the bedrock of how we stayed alive.
Yeah.
We relied on a very specific type of physical, externalized courage to protect the tribe from an environment that was, frankly, constantly trying to kill us.
But then you step into the modern institutional landscape. You walk into the corporate boardrooms, you set foot on university campuses, you sit down in like an HR seminar, and suddenly that exact same narrative is flipped completely on its head.
Completely inverted, yeah.
So I really want to speak directly to you, the listener, right now, especially the men out there who are navigating today's rapidly, almost violently shifting institutional landscapes. Do you ever feel like the very traits that built civilization, your drive to conquer a problem, your spatial risk calculus, your blunt assertiveness, are suddenly being pathologized?
Like you're walking through a minefield.
Exactly. A daily minefield where your basic biological operating system is considered an HR liability.
And that is the core friction of our current era. It's what you might call institutional whiplash. We have constructed a society that demands the fruits of traditional masculinity, right? The infrastructure, the safety, the emergency response.
Right.
But we're actively penalizing the biological roots that produce those exact things.
It's that friction is the absolute epicenter of what we are getting into today. But before we get into the thick of this, I need to ask you to do us a quick favor. Please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the show. It's how we keep bringing you these deep dives. Today, we are doing a comprehensive review of a highly controversial, incredibly incisive, and, I gotta say, ultra-long new ebook. Consider this your must-read survival guide for understanding the history of our institutions. How they operated and thrived before they were fundamentally altered. And in the author's view, captured by modern progressive, feminist, and Marxist ideologies.
It's a heavy text.
It really is. So I highly recommend you pause this deep dive right now. Check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book and tell them we sent you. The book is called Microaggressions, Female Neuroticism, and Relational Aggression Uber Alles by Conrad Riker. And to keep up with his ongoing work, you absolutely need to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Yeah, the scope of Riker's book is just massive. It is an explosive piece of literature. I mean, he isn't just looking at one isolated issue.
Oh, no.
He is weaving together evolutionary biology, corporate organizational dynamics, the structural framework of our legal systems, and even the intensely personal arena of modern dating. And he is analyzing all of this through a very specific, highly critical lens.
And because he touches the third rail of so many cultural issues here, we really need to state the mission for today's deep dive with absolute clarity.
Yes, we do.
We are diving into some highly politically charged, red-pilled content today. We want to be absolutely clear to you, the listener. We are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints in this book.
Exactly.
Our job is to impartially report on the original source material, decode its arguments, and help you understand exactly what the author is saying to his audience. We are here to map the territory, analyze the data he presents, and just unpack the mechanisms behind his worldview.
Precisely. Because knowledge is most valuable when you can understand it objectively from all angles. Our goal is to figure out the why and the how of his arguments, rather than just listing what he's angry about.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Riker starts his entire thesis by identifying what he calls the survival paradox. He points to a statistic that honestly often gets completely buried in modern discussions of workplace equality, which is that 92% of workplace deaths are men.
Right, and that statistic is the anchor for his first major argument. He isn't just throwing that number out there to win a privileged debate online, He's using it to highlight a fundamental asymmetry in how society views and, frankly, consumes male sacrifice.
Yeah.
To illustrate the psychological reality of this, he brings up the story of FDNY firefighter Steven Siller on September 11th.
Oh, man, yeah. For those who don't know, Siller had just finished his shift.
Right.
He heard about the first plane hitting the towers on his scanner. He drove his truck to the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, but it's already closed for security.
Right.
So Siller just abandons his truck, straps 60 pounds of firefighting gear onto his back, and literally sprints 2 miles on foot through the tunnel to reach the World Trade Center, where he eventually died saving civilians.
It is a universally recognized act of immense, transcendent heroism. Siller bypassed protocol because the reality of the situation demanded immediate physical action.
Yeah, you don't wait for permission there.
Exactly. But Riker takes that universally revered act and contrasts it with the modern bureaucratic mindset that now governs our daily lives. He argues that if a similar scenario happened today, in a less apocalyptic context, that exact same act of spontaneous, high-risk heroism would immediately trigger a massive HR investigation for what does he call it, a reckless protocol deviation.
Yeah, and he backs this up with a modern anecdote that honestly made me do a double take. He cites an OSHA incident, Occupational Safety and Health Administration in New Jersey.
Oh, the frozen pond story.
Yes, so a construction crew was working near a frozen pond, and they saw a child fall to the ice. The crew didn't wait for emergency services. I mean, they grabbed a ladder from their site, pushed it out over the ice to distribute their weight, and pulled the drowning kid to safety. And OSHA's
So
response,
this is the crazy part.
they fined the construction company because using the ladder in that manner violated fall protection standards.
It perfectly encapsulates Riker's point. OSHA's mandate is ostensibly to keep people safe. But in practice, the bureaucracy has become completely detached from the physical reality of danger. The institution literally punished the instinct to save a life because it didn't fit neatly into a compliance spreadsheet.
And it doesn't stop there either. He mentions an EMT who was fired for performing the Heimlich maneuver on a choking toddler.
Wait, fired?
Fired. The reason, he didn't have the parents sign consent forms before dislodging the food from the kid's throat,
Unbelievable.
which leads to a terrifying downstream effect. Like, Riker points to a 2023 Rasmussen poll showing that 62% of men now actively fear lawsuits or professional ruin if they intervene in public emergencies.
And this is where we really have to look at the underlying mechanism, right? The why. Why is society suddenly punishing these actions, and what is the biological cost of suppressing them?
Right, because he goes deep into biology here.
He does. He leans heavily into evolutionary psychology. He points to the biological wiring of the male brain under duress. He cites this 2022 meta-analysis published in the journal Evolutionary Psychology that measured cognitive responses to sudden environmental threats.
Okay.
The data showed that men under acute stress exhibit a 37% spike in threat assessment accuracy compared to women. Riker calls this mechanism spatial risk calculus.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. So if we go back to our hunter-gatherer ancestors, when a saber-toothed tiger suddenly appears in the brush, the male brain is bathed in a cocktail of adrenaline and testosterone that effectively slows down time.
Exactly.
It allows him to calculate the speed of the tiger, the distance to the nearest weapon, and the trajectory of the strike, all without freezing up.
Yes. Testosterone is fundamentally misunderstood in modern discourse, according to Riker. I mean, it doesn't just build muscle mass or make someone aggressive for the sake of being aggressive.
Right.
In a crisis, testosterone recalibrates the neural pathways to prioritize group survival over individual safety. It is a biological operating system designed for extreme triage.
So Riker is essentially arguing that society is treating this male biological operating system like a dangerous software bug that needs to be patched out. But historically, that exact bug was the core programming that kept the human tribe alive.
That's his point, yeah.
Like, we're trying to run a high-performance rendering engine on a smartwatch, and when the hardware inevitably runs hot, the modern HR department treats the heat exhaust as a malfunction, rather than the necessary byproduct of keeping the system running.
That is a phenomenal analogy, and it aligns perfectly with his premise. By pathologizing this risk calculus as hypermasculine aggression or toxic masculinity, he claims that our institutions are engaging in systemic social emasculation.
Wow.
And he traces this deliberate softening across institutions that were traditionally meant to forge this exact kind of resilience.
Yeah, let's look at the Boy Scouts. Riker spends a lot of time on this. He notes that in 2018, the organization rebranded to Scouts BSA to become fully inclusive of girls. Now, on paper, that sounds like a win for equality.
Sure.
But Riker argues that the internal curriculum fundamentally shifted to accommodate this change. He claims they systematically replaced rigorous, high-stress campfire competitions, activities designed to test survival skills, resilience, not tying under physical pressure, with what he dismissively calls inclusive, marshmallow roasting circles.
And the institutional fallout of that was severe.
16% of local councils dissolved within 3 years of that pivot.
He connects this institutional softening directly to the broader mental health crisis affecting men and boys. Like, he cites a massive Harvard meta-analysis showing that male suicide rates have spiked 37% since 2010.
That's a massive jump.
It is. And Riker provocatively inversely tracks this spike directly to the systemic dismantling of militarized, male-only bonding rituals. He argues that boys actually need physical friction to develop psychological stability. He even brings the military into this, which is wild to me. He points to the Navy SEALs, arguably the most elite physical force on the planet. Riker claims they saw a 19% spike in dropouts during Hell Week, right after they introduced trauma sensitivity drills into the curriculum.
Right. His quote on that is pretty blunt.
Oh, yeah. He literally writes, "Nothing prepares you for a chaotic combat theater like weeping in a yurt."
It's a very cutting critique. He also looks at the broader U.S. Army, pointing out their 2023 recruitment ad campaigns that prominently featured things like Warrior Meditation Mondays and yoga sessions.
Right.
He juxtaposes those campaigns with the fact that overall enlistment has plummeted by 25% since 2020. Riker's argument is that you simply cannot attract men who are biologically wired to conquer challenges by offering them a spa day. To really hammer this home, he contrasts these failing modern institutions with historical and alternative models that lean completely into that biological operating system. He brings up the Spartan-a-Go system, the brutal training regime, where boys face artificial scarcity, starvation, and physical combat to become the warriors who held the line at Thermopylae.
Now, obviously, he isn't advocating we return to ancient Spartan child abuse.
No, but he points to a modern equivalent, the Wilderness Challenge in Montana. It's a program where teenage boys are dropped into the wilderness to hunt elk with handmade bows for 3 weeks. There are no therapists, no DEI counselors, and absolutely zero trigger warnings.
And the biological result of that program.
Riker claims these participants show a 62% higher baseline testosterone level post-trial and report virtually zero markers for clinical anxiety. He literally writes, "Sometimes the absolute best mental health treatment a young man can receive is a bloody knuckle and a conquered mountain."
The underlying analysis here is crucial for understanding Riker's worldview. He isn't just, an old man yelling at clouds, lamenting the loss of tough guys in 80s action movies.
Right, he's making a structural argument.
Exactly, a sociological argument.
Yeah.
He is saying that by intentionally stripping men of the tools that evolved to manage chaos hierarchy, risk-taking, physical stoicism, and replacing them with a procedural, feminized model of emotional processing, we are actively making our society less safe.
Yeah.
We demand that men act like John McClane the second a crisis hits, but we treat them like toxic, unhinged liabilities 99% of the time.
He has a brilliant term for this, the feminist bait and switch. Society demands the physical protection of the male, but aggressively criminalizes the exact biological instincts required to provide it.
He highlights a great story about a Georgia man to prove this.
Yeah, a man who witnessed a mugger grab a woman's purse on the street. The man instinctively tackles the mugger, restrains him, and returns the purse and his reward. He spent 3 days in jail because the victim filed a police report claiming the man infantilized her by assuming she couldn't handle the situation herself.
It sounds absurd, but it illustrates the cultural tightrope men are walking right now. He brings up another incident where a Michigan father was permanently banned from his local gym.
Oh, this one is infuriating.
Why was he banned? Because he saw a woman struggling mid-bench press, the bar was crushing her chest, and he stepped in to grab it. Instead of a thank you, she filmed him, posted it to Instagram, calling him a mansplaining creep, and got him banned.
Jeez.
Riker notes a broader legal trend here, citing data that civil lawsuits over unwanted male assistants in public spaces have surged 40% since 2015.
Which leads to his proposed solution, which is so extreme it's almost satirical, yet he seems dead serious. He suggests the implementation of liability-free chivalry contracts.
How does that even work?
Basically, before a woman enters a shared physical space like a gym or a university campus, she would sign a waiver legally authorizing men to offer physical assistance without the threat of harassment claims. Because right now, the chilling effect is complete. I mean, he cites a Pew poll stating that 72% of men report they completely avoid assisting unknown women in public spaces to protect themselves.
It's a very stark, almost dystopian picture of our physical reality. He is meticulously documenting how traditional heroism is being actively penalized on the streets. But as we pivot into the next section of his thesis, Riker argues that a much quieter, vastly more insidious form of psychological warfare has already completely conquered the white-collar world.
Yeah, that brings us to the corporate boardrooms.
Yeah.
If the physical world is penalizing male biology, the corporate world has basically outlawed it. Riker argues that modern HR departments act as the enforcement arm for this psychological warfare. And again, he doesn't just blame a sudden cultural shift. He roots this entirely in evolutionary biology.
This is where we need to unpack his concept of relational aggression, because it's the engine driving his entire corporate critique.
Right.
From an evolutionary standpoint, physical combat was exclusively the domain of men. If a prehistoric man gets into a dispute over status or resources, he uses violence. But if a prehistoric woman gets into a physical fight, she risks catastrophic injury, which jeopardizes not just herself, but her dependent offspring.
Makes sense.
Therefore, evolutionary psychologists argue that women evolved entirely different mechanisms to compete for resources and status. They utilized social manipulation, gossip, ostracism, reputational sabotage, and coalition building against rivals. This is what Riker calls relational aggression.
So it achieves the goal of destroying a rival without the physical risk of a fistfight.
Exactly. And Riker's explosive claim is that this ancient evolutionary survival mechanism hasn't disappeared. It has simply been dressed up in corporate jargon and weaponized in the modern workplace under the guise of empathy and emotional safety.
He literally refers to HR departments as neuroticism monetizers.
Yes, let's examine the evidence he uses to construct this argument. He points to a highly publicized $1.2 million lawsuit that Google had to pay out after they fired a senior male engineer.
Oh, the Python script guy.
Yes. This engineer conducted a routine code review for a female colleague. He pointed out flaws in her Python scripts. The female colleague then filed a complaint stating that his tone during the review caused her to suffer acute panic attacks.
And the craziest part of this anecdote is that during discovery, it was proven that not a single line of his technical feedback was factually incorrect.
Right.
He was objectively right about the code. But Riker says his actual crime was insufficient maternal cooing while critiquing her Python scripts. He was fired not for incompetence, but for failing to manage her emotional dysregulation.
Riker uses this to illustrate a systemic shift. He points out that according to the EEOC, 78% of emotional distress complaints in the workplace now revolve around these highly subjective vibe checks rather than concrete acts of discrimination.
Vibe checks, wow.
The result is a massive chilling effect. Riker argues that highly competent men are increasingly muzzling their honest feedback to avoid HR crucifixion. He cites surveys showing that 65% of male coworkers admit to falsifying or softening 360-degree employee reviews of female colleagues simply to avoid being targeted by an HR investigation.
He also brings up a fascinating case study at Ford. A female HR director implemented a policy canceling all quarterly performance rankings because, in her words, the concept of ranking feels inherently oppressive.
And what happened?
Well, Riker claims the data shows this caused male productivity metrics at the company to crater by 30% within a matter of months.
Because you removed the exact mechanism, status competition, and meritocratic hierarchy that motivates the male biological drive.
Exactly.
But it goes deeper. Riker cites a massive internal Deloitte study showing that female employees who initiate complaints about a toxic workplace actually move up the corporate ladder 33% quicker than those who quietly rely on hard work and output. He calls this phenomenon social credit farming.
Okay, hold up. I have to push back on this because it's a massive generalization. Riker is framing the entire corporate ecosystem as a zero-sum deathmatch between male competence and female cortisol. But is he seriously suggesting that all corporate empathy, all diversity initiatives, and all HR departments are just a massive biological grift?
That's his premise.
It sounds like he's saying the modern water cooler is literally the Salem witch trials, just with stock options and better dental benefits.
Well, that is precisely the historical parallel he draws.
Are you serious?
Yes. Riker spends several pages comparing modern HR tribunals to the Salem witch trials. He notes that in Salem, a respected woman named Rebecca Nurse was hanged purely because a young girl named Abigail Williams collapsed in court and claimed Nurse's specter was attacking her.
So no physical evidence?
No physical evidence, only the weaponization of female distress. Riker argues that modern Title IX hearings in HR tribunals operate on the exact same spectral logic. If a woman feels harmed, the harm is treated as objective reality. He calls this mate expulsion theater, adapted for the boardroom.
Wow.
Ancestral women used gossip and feigned distress to exile rivals from the tribe. Today's boardrooms have simply swapped the spears for Slack threads.
And when you look at some of the corporate casualties he lists, you start to see the pattern he's tracing. He brings up a Boeing jet engineer who was denied a critical promotion. Why? Because 3 female co-workers filed a joint complaint stating that he stared aggressively during safety meetings.
Stared aggressively.
Yeah, not that his wing designs were mathematically flawed, not that he's a slur, just his facial resting state. And Riker notes that Boeing's safety record and share price both plummeted shortly after engineers like him started leaving the company.
Or take the case of David Chen, a brilliant tech CEO who was ousted by his own board after HR cited him for intimidating eye contact during end-of-year bonus negotiations.
Eye contact.
Riker analyzes this through his evolutionary lens. Chen was a leader hyper-focused on raw numeric output and fair compensation, but he triggered compliance officers whose subconscious biological mandate, according to Riker, is enforcing male submission to female emotional comfort.
He backs this up with some brutal data from the Harvard Business Review. Their studies show that when men aggressively negotiate their salaries, they earn 7% more on average. But 64% of the time, those same men get slapped with informal hostility or difficult to work with labels by HR.
But for women,
Meanwhile, when women follow Sheryl Sandberg's famous lean-in advice and negotiate just as aggressively, they are celebrated for being fierce and routinely get the promotions.
what makes this book so compelling and controversial is that Riker doesn't just complain. He offers radically disruptive solutions. To combat this weaponized gossip, he was consulted by a Texas oil firm to restructure their HR department. He implemented what he calls $500 truth bonds.
Okay, this part I couldn't believe.
Right. Here's how it works mechanically.
Yeah.
If an employee wants to formally accuse a colleague of a microaggression, a toxic tone, or workplace gossip, they must stake $500 of their own salary on the claim.
Like putting chips on a table.
Exactly. A third-party arbiter investigates. If the claim is verified, the company matches the $500 as a bonus to the victim. But if the claim is proven to be subjective, exaggerated, or entirely false, the accuser forfeits their $500 directly into the paycheck of the accused.
That is a staggering policy.
Yeah.
And the results? Riker claims that gossip and microaggression complaints dropped by 89% within 6 months. His quote on this is legendary. He says, "It turns out that human beings magically develop incredibly rigorous evidentiary standards the absolute second their own manicure budget is on the line."
By attaching a literal economic cost to relational aggression, he neutralized it. He also looks to antiquity for organizational models. He cites the operational structure of the 15th Roman Legion. He notes that they strictly banned women from their military encampments.
But not for the reason people think.
Right. Riker argues this wasn't out of some cartoonish misogyny, but based on a cold, calculated reality. Weeping, emotional intrigue, and social sabotage do not win wars, they destroy unit cohesion. The Legion instituted a policy called Gladium non lacrima, swords not tears.
Swords, not tears.
Riker suggests that modern corporations facing global competition need to adopt a similar ethos. He advocates for entirely replacing modern HR departments with what he calls warrior boards, staffed exclusively by retired military logistics officers who only measure output, not feelings.
He gives an example of a massive regional plumbing and logistics company that literally resolves minor workplace disputes by having the employees compete in axe-throwing competitions in the warehouse.
That's amazing.
Right. Whoever wins the match gets the preferred shift schedule. No mediators, no feelings charts. And the result was a 94% drop in official grievances. He is arguing that when you completely strip feelings out of the equation and institute strict physical or meritocratic accountability, competence thrives.
He points to Elon Musk at SpaceX for this, too.
Oh, right.
Musk notoriously axed over 200 HR and DEI staffers in a single week in 2022. Following that purge, SpaceX's launch cadence and productivity metrics went entirely vertical.
It's a compelling synthesis of data and philosophy. But Riker argues that you can't just fight this in the boardroom. Because if HR is the corporate executioner, the training ground for this entire ideology, the factory where this operating system is installed in young minds before they ever see a cubicle, is the modern university campus.
Which brings us to the ideological battleground of academia. Riker draws a parallel here that is going to make a lot of academics furious. He explicitly compares modern wokeism and critical theory to Marxist Lysenkoism.
Okay, to understand the weight of that comparison, we really have to understand the history of Trofim Lysenko.
Right.
Lysenko was a Soviet agronomist backed directly by Joseph Stalin in the 1930s. At the time, the rest of the world was embracing Mendelian genetics, hard, observable scientific evidence about how traits are passed down in plants.
But Lysenko rejected genetics because it conflicted with Marxist ideology.
Exactly. He argued that plants, like the Soviet proletariat, could be trained to thrive in harsh environments through collective exposure, completely ignoring their biological limitations. Because he had the backing of the state, his pseudoscience became mandatory law. Dissenting scientists were executed or sent to the gulags.
And the physical result of replacing hard science with political ideology, massive, catastrophic crop failures that contributed to the starvation of millions of people in the Soviet Union and later in Maoist China.
Okay, I have to jump in here because that is an unbelievably intense parallel to draw. Comparing a gender studies department pushing decolonizing math to Stalin's pseudoscientists starving millions of peasants, how does he justify that leap? He's essentially arguing that prioritizing lived experience over hard empirical data isn't just an annoyance, but a literal civilization-ending threat.
He justifies it by looking at the structural mechanics of both movements. He argues that just as Lysenkoism replaced objective wheat yields with Marxist agrarian ideology, what he calls woke Lysenkoism replaces objective biological reality with fluid gender ideology. And he points to the exact same mechanisms of ideological purging.
Right.
He extensively details the firing of evolutionary biologist Colin Wright. Wright was a highly respected researcher whose career essentially imploded overnight in 2017. His crime. During a mandatory corporate diversity training session, Wright calmly stated a basic empirical biological fact that sex in mammals is strictly binary.
Riker calls this a modern-day purge. He says that today's professionals face the exact same ideological loyalty tests as Soviet farmers. The only difference is that the commissars of our age don't carry rifles and red armbands. They carry clipboards and DEI manuals.
To understand how campuses got to this point, Riker traces the intellectual lineage back to the 1930s. He specifically targets the critical theory developed by the Frankfurt School. He notes that their original manifestos explicitly stated that the nuclear family, private property, and traditional Western religion were the primary obstacles to Marxist utopia, and therefore had to be dismantled.
And he draws a straight line from that.
Yes, to Herbert Marcuse's 1965 essay on repressive tolerance. Marcuse argued a deeply paradoxical point, that to achieve true tolerance, society must actively crush and silence any speech that challenges progressive dogma while unconditionally allowing subversive speech.
No tolerance through intolerance.
Exactly. And Riker argues that Marcuse's doctrine is the literal operating system of every modern university in the West.
And the anecdotes he uses to prove this are chilling. He spends a whole chapter on the Brett Weinstein incident at Evergreen State College in 2017.
I remember that.
For listeners who don't remember, Evergreen held a traditional day of absence where minority students would voluntarily leave campus to highlight their contributions. But in 2017, the organizers flipped it. They demanded that all white staff and students leave the campus.
Which is crazy.
Yeah. Weinstein, a lifelong progressive biology professor, sent a polite email refusing to participate, stating that demanding a specific racial group leave a public space is the definition of racism, regardless of who is doing it.
And how did the campus react?
For simply suggesting that equality shouldn't mean swapping one racial hierarchy for another, Weinstein was literally hunted through the academic buildings by roving mobs of students carrying baseball bats, while the cowardly college president told the police to stand down.
Riker views the Weinstein incident not as an anomaly, but as the inevitable terminus of this ideology. He argues that universities have entirely abandoned the pursuit of truth, prioritizing grievance over merit. He calls modern campuses re-education camps for neo-Marxist orthodoxy. He points to NPR hosting serious debates about decolonizing mathematics, and cites a staggering RAND Corporation survey showing that 37% of K-12 teachers have actively embraced the idea that objective math is rooted in white supremacy.
But the silver lining in Riker's book is that he believes this system is finally beginning to fracture under the weight of its own absurdity. He brings up a very revealing story about a gender studies professor at the University of Michigan who abruptly quit in 2023.
Oh, the Substack manifesto.
Yes, she published a viral manifesto titled, "Why I Quit Teaching Grievance Studies." In it, she exposed the total collapse of academic rigor, revealing that she was forced to pass students who were literally citing anonymous Tumblr posts as primary sources for their final dissertations.
This is where Riker connects the ideology to the economics. He unpacks the mechanism of how this capture is funded. He points out a glaring economic hypocrisy. Taxpayers fund roughly 68% of the budget for public universities.
Right.
Yet, when you look at LinkedIn employment data, 70% of graduates with degrees in grievance studies, so gender studies, critical race theory, etc., either become HR commissars, perpetuating the cycle, or end up working as baristas because their degrees have zero market value.
He characterizes the modern university as a state-subsidized debt factory that produces nothing but neuroticism and resentment.
Exactly.
He has a hilarious and poignant example of his friend who walked away from a gender studies degree with $80,000 in student debt. This guy realized the scam, dropped out of the master's program, and started an HVAC company. He is now clearing $250,000 a year.
That's a great pivot.
Yeah. As Riker writes, he's committing actual physical aggressions against thermostats instead of whining about microaggressions, and society is paying him handsomely for it.
To fix this massive misallocation of resources, Riker proposes legislative action he calls the Defund Act. The mechanics are simple. Redirect every single taxpayer dollar currently wasted on what he calls queer ecology seminars and fat studies, and pour that money directly into welding labs, plumbing apprenticeships, and coding boot camps.
And he notes that the free market is already responding. He highlights the massive success of newly formed anti-woke educational institutions.
Like the University of Austin.
Yes, which was founded explicitly on free speech and STEM meritocracy, and they saw their applications triple in a single year. Furthermore, he points to legislative victories like the state of Tennessee legally defunding grievance studies programs in 2023, which resulted in a 90% drop in enrollment for those specific majors overnight.
But Riker stresses that the ideological capture on campus isn't just about what books you read, it has fundamentally corrupted the legal framework of the university. He dedicates a massive portion of this section to analyzing Title IX tribunals. Now, Title IX was originally passed to ensure equal funding for women's sports. But Riker claims it has mutated into a shadow justice system on campuses.
The statistics on this are insane.
They are. He provides data showing that these tribunals have an astonishing 80% conviction rate against accused men, operating entirely as kangaroo courts where the fundamental Western legal principle of innocent until proven guilty is completely dead.
He breaks down exactly how these tribunals operate compared to an actual court of law. He cites the case of an engineering student who was abruptly expelled in his senior year. The reason? His ex-girlfriend retroactively decided months after they broke up that the entire relationship was non-consensual because she felt emotionally manipulated.
Was there evidence?
There was no physical evidence. There were no witnesses. But Riker explains that under the modern Believe Women framework mandated by Title IX administrators, these campus tribunals operate on a standard of evidence called a preponderance of the evidence.
So not beyond a reasonable doubt.
No. That means they only need to be 51% certain that an assault occurred to expel a male student and destroy his life. As Riker points out, that is a significantly lower burden of proof than you would need in small claims court if you were accused of stealing your neighbor's lawnmower.
And he highlights just how easily this structurally biased system is gamed by malicious actors. He points to a terrifying case involving a father in Ohio. This dad was checking his teenage daughter's iPad and discovered a group chat.
Oh, this is the text message story.
Yes. His daughter and her friends were actively plotting to frame a rival girl at their school as racist. They were using apps to Photoshop fake text message screenshots with racial slurs, planning to send them to the principal.
And what was the motive?
Because the rival girl was competing with his daughter for the same homecoming dress style.
It sounds like a scene from Mean Girls, but Riker uses it to illustrate a profound structural danger. When an institution abandons objective evidence and prioritizes the subjective narrative of the alleged victim, it hands a loaded weapon to anyone willing to weaponize their own biology.
Which transitions us into the most controversial, provocative, and biological section of the entire book.
Yeah, this gets intense.
Riker argues that this abandonment of evidence isn't just a political phenomenon. It is driven by deep psychological strategies utilized in personal relationships.
Strap in, folks.
Ah, yeah.
Because this is where Riker takes his evolutionary theories and applies them directly to the modern dating market. He makes the explosive claim that female biology and psychology, specifically hormonal cycles, and the traits associated with borderline personality disorder are literally being weaponized against men in the legal system.
To build this argument, he returns to the concept of relational aggression that we discussed in the corporate section, but he looks at its raw, unfiltered origin in teenage girls.
Right.
If young boys have a conflict, They might resort to a fist fight behind the gym. It's violent, but it's overt, it ends quickly, and the hierarchy is established. But Riker cites researchers from UCLA who observe that teenage girls view covert social sabotage as a necessary survival skill. They use rumor mills, exclusion, and reputational destruction.
And the consequences are real.
Very real. He connects this to a tragic CDC study that linked 68% of teen suicides directly to relational aggression and cyberbullying, noting that in those cases, girls were the primary perpetrators 89% of the time.
He has a quote from a 14-year-old boy in a focus group that is absolutely haunting. The boy said, "If a guy hates you, he punches you in the face. If a girl hates you, she convinces the entire friend group you're a school shooter."
And Riker's thesis is that this behavior doesn't magically stop at graduation. It scales up into adulthood. And because our institutions now prioritize feelings over facts, this relational aggression dictates legal outcomes.
Right.
He points to a highly controversial University of Michigan study analyzing false accusations. The researchers claim that up to 72% of definitively proven false sexual assault and domestic violence claims occurred during the accuser's luteal phase.
Okay, we need to pause and define the biology here. The luteal phase is the hormonal window, usually a week or so right before a woman's menstrual cycle begins. It's commonly associated with PMS, where there's a massive crash in estrogen and progesterone.
Correct. Riker argues that this hormonal crash triggers extreme emotional dysregulation, paranoia, and a heightened sensitivity to perceived abandonment. He interviewed a former college athlete who spent $83,000 in legal fees, proving that his ex-girlfriend fabricated rape claims against him.
That's a staggering amount of money.
Yeah, and she made the claims during this exact hormonal window. When she finally confessed to the police, she admitted that she wasn't assaulted. She just felt emotionally abandoned that weekend and wanted to legally destroy him for making her feel that way. Riker characterizes this as biochemical sabotage.
But he goes even further than just hormones, right? He dives into pathology. He focuses intensely on borderline personality disorder, or BPD.
Yes, he does.
Now, for our listeners, BPD is a cluster B personality disorder characterized by a terror of abandonment, intense mood swings, impulsivity, and a chronic pattern of unstable relationships. Riker cites data from the National Institute of Mental Health claiming that nearly 1 in 5 women exhibit at least some traits of BPD in high-stress dating scenarios.
And here's the kicker.
Right. He argues that our modern family courts actively reward this exact pathology. He cites data suggesting that in incredibly toxic, protracted parental alienation cases where one parent brainwashes a child to hate the other, over 90% of those cases involve mothers displaying high BPD traits.
It's a very heavy claim.
Okay, I have to step in and challenge this aggressively because this sounds like pure misogyny dressed up as biological pseudoscience. Riker is essentially advising his male readers to treat modern dating like a forensic financial audit.
Well, he does call it romantic counterinsurgency.
Exactly. He literally tells guys to download apps like Clue or Flow and secretly track their partner's menstrual cycles, like a commodities trader watching soybean futures. I mean, tracking a partner's cycle to predict when she might falsely accuse you of a felony. That crosses the line from being cautious into clinical paranoia. Is Riker actually presenting hard data that this happens at scale across society? Or was he just cherry-picking the top 0.01% of absolute nightmare scenarios to sell a controversial book to angry men?
It is a totally valid and necessary critique of his work. Riker is focusing on the catastrophic extremes.
Right.
However, he justifies focusing on these extremes because the legal consequences for a man in that 0.001% scenario are total annihilation. He argues that in a system lacking due process, extreme defensive biology is the only rational response.
And his solution for that?
To mitigate this risk, he proposes what he calls the 90-day rule for men in the dating market. He advises men that if a new partner hasn't accused you of gaslighting, narcissism, or emotional abuse within 3 full menstrual cycles, then you can proceed, but only cautiously. He views the modern dating market as an incredibly hazardous landscape for men who have resources. He brings up an anecdote about a software engineer named Dave. Dave was deeply in love and engaged, but 6 weeks before a $40,000 wedding, he abruptly canceled everything and walked away.
Because of the 5G demons.
Yes. Because he discovered his fiancée had secretly maxed out 3 of his credit cards to buy literal healing crystals because she believed they needed to ward off 5G demons from their new home.
And Riker doesn't frame this as a sad breakup. He frames Dave as an absolute tactical genius. He writes that Dave lost some deposits, but he successfully dodged a $500,000 bullet in future divorce settlements and alimony.
Riker uses all of this to break down the broader evolutionary rationale. Why do women engage in this kind of chaotic testing? He claims that historically, women evolved to test a male's commitment and resilience by introducing emotional chaos. If he stays calm, he's a capable protector. Furthermore, women compete for the highest status males via gossip and ostracism.
Though we see that everywhere in media.
We do. He argues this is the exact reason female-led reality television shows like The Real Housewives are so massively successful. He notes a leaked email from a reality TV network executive instructing producers to actively cut 70% of substantive, positive conversations between the women and instead artificially engineer catfights and backstabbing.
And the result was what?
A 22% spike in ratings. The audience is biologically hardwired to consume female status jockeying.
It's all about resource allocation and status. But the most alarming part of this section, and the part that ties back into the legal system, is a concept he introduces called the emotional credibility paradox.
This is perhaps his most fascinating psychological observation. He cites neurobiological researchers from the Netherlands who conducted a bizarre but revealing experiment. They collected the tears of crying women and exposed male subjects to them.
Yeah.
They found that merely smelling female tears caused the men to suffer a 40% drop in their testosterone levels within minutes.
From an evolutionary perspective, that makes perfect sense. If a sobbing cave woman is holding a baby, the male needs his aggression instantly suppressed so he can pivot from fighting a threat to nurturing and protecting her. It was a vital adaptive trait for human survival.
Exactly. But today, Riker argues, this exact biological mechanism completely bypasses our modern forensic reality.
He points to studies from Stanford psychologists proving that when a woman is visibly crying on a witness stand, juries perceive her as 30% more truthful, even in mock trials where the jury is explicitly told she has a history of perjury.
That's wild.
The tears literally short-circuit the male brain's ability to demand evidence. He cites data from the Innocence Project suggesting that up to 62% of wrongful convictions involving female accusers hinged entirely on this emotional credibility rather than physical evidence.
He tells a story about a Florida teacher to back this up.
Yes. The teacher fired in 2019 after a female student claimed he mocked her accent. The student posted a video crying uncontrollably, the local media pounced, and the school board fired him immediately to appease the mob. Months later, the student nonchalantly admitted on a podcast that he never mocked her. She just knew that crying on camera would guarantee her more TikTok followers. But his career was already destroyed.
So, if we take a step back and synthesize Riker's worldview up to this point, physical male heroism is actively penalized by OSHA and the state.
Yeah.
The corporate world has been hijacked by neurotic HR monetizers who punish competence. The universities have abandoned empirical facts in favor of Marxist gender ideology. And the dating market is a biological minefield where female tears and hormonal fluctuations dictate legal reality. It paints an incredibly bleak, almost apocalyptic picture of modern institutional life for men.
It really does. It sounds like he thinks the game is completely rigged and entirely hopeless. But in the final section of the book, Riker actually identifies a massive grassroots rebellion brewing against this entire system. And here is the truly fascinating twist.
What's the twist?
According to Riker, this rebellion isn't being led by angry men on internet forums. It's being led by women themselves.
This is a brilliant pivot in his argument. It brings us to the phenomenon of the motherhood mirage and the rise of the tradwife rebellion. Riker levels a remarkably harsh, data-driven critique against what he calls the feminist industrial complex.
He claims that for the last 50 years, this complex sold women a fundamental soul-crushing lie, that spreadsheet cells could perfectly replace family cells.
Right.
They told women that clawing their way up the middle management ladder of a soulless corporation was the truest form of empowerment, and that the traditional roles of wife and mother roles that women evolved over millennia to find deeply fulfilling were actually tools of patriarchal oppression.
He calls this the feminine productivity paradox. He argues that modern careerism essentially cannibalizes a woman's evolved biological purpose. To prove this, he cites longitudinal data from Harvard Medical School that tracked baseline cortisol, the primary stress hormone in women, over decades.
And what did they find?
The researchers found something that completely contradicts the modern feminist narrative. Homemakers in the 1950s, the era often painted as the peak of female oppression, showed biological stress markers that were 18% lower than today's modern, heavily medicated, dual-income, childless professional women.
His commentary on this stat is brutal. He writes, "Your great-grandmother didn't need a Xanax prescription to handle a colicky baby and a mortgage, but she also wasn't getting passive-aggressive Slack notifications from a 23-year-old project manager during midnight feedings."
To explain why women are so burnt out by the corporate world, Riker posits a sociobiological theory he calls the domestic dominance hierarchy.
Right, let's unpack that.
He argues that while men evolved to compete for macro status, conquering territories, building skyscrapers, climbing massive corporate hierarchies, women evolved to seek and dominate micro territories. Specifically, a well-kept home, a cohesive family unit, and thriving children. In that domain, the mother is the absolute apex predator. She is the CEO of the biological family.
But because the modern corporate office completely stars this instinct, forcing women to act like men in a cubicle, we are seeing a massive systemic psychological backlash.
Exactly.
And this backlash is materializing as the trad wife movement. We are seeing Generation Z women, the demographic that was supposed to be the most radicalized by progressive institutions, actively prioritizing home economics over gender economics.
It's all over social media.
Yeah, he points to the cultural zeitgeist, noting how hashtags like barefoot and pregnant are unironically trending on TikTok right alongside standard influencer thirst traps. He tells the story of Clara, a woman who ground her way up to a CEO position in the tech sector only to suffer a massive burnout panic attack at age 32.
And what does she do?
She quit her job, moved to a rural state, and started a local sourdough bread baking empire from her kitchen. She now out-earns her old tech salary. And her secret. Riker quotes her directly. Quote, "I realized I was miserable trying to act like a man. I stopped competing with men, and I started feeding them."
The irony is incredibly potent. Riker is pointing out that the ultimate existential rebellion against the progressive feminist establishment isn't coming from conservative politicians. It's coming from young women who want to bake bread, raise chickens, and homeschool their kids.
Right.
He backs this up with data, noting that independent homeschool co-ops have surged by 200% since the COVID lockdowns. And more importantly, Gallup polls found that mothers participating in these traditional co-ops report a 72% higher baseline of daily happiness than their corporate dual-income peers.
But Riker isn't just a cultural commentator. I mean, he always ties it back to the money. He looks at the policy and economics enforcing the current system, a system he calls the fiscal matriarchy.
Yes. He argues that the state actively hates the traditional family unit because it is economically self-sufficient. In Riker's view, dual-income households are absolute cash cows for the bureaucratic state. Think about the mechanics. If both parents work, the state taxes the father's income, taxes the mother's income, and then taxes the commercial daycare center you are now forced to pay because no one is home to raise the child.
He points out the absurdity of the U.S. tax code's marriage penalty, calculating that the system essentially levies a $12,000 annual hidden fine on families that choose to have stay-at-home mother.
He claims the government deliberately profits by dismantling the nuclear family to fund bloated, ineffective state programs. So his policy solution is to aggressively reverse this. He says we need to eliminate all marriage penalties and instantly mimic the pro-family policies implemented in Hungary.
The Hungarian model is a massive point of discussion in conservative circles right now. Hungary realized their birth rates were collapsing, so they implemented a radical tax policy. They slashed income taxes for parents, and if a woman has 4 or more children, she pays 0 income tax for the rest of her life.
And the mechanical result, according to Riker's data, was a 27% surge in the national birth rate in just 3 years, coupled with a massive drop in divorces. He argues that when governments financially incentivize marital stability and biological reality instead of taxing it into oblivion, families organically thrive.
He also touches on how modern technology has completely warped this natural pairing process. He argues that dating apps like Tinder and Bumble have turned female hypergamy, which is the evolutionary drive for women to partner with higher status, wealthier men, into an absolute blood sport.
Because of the accent.
Exactly. Because women have access to the top 1% of men globally on their phones, they hold out for billionaire CEOs while simultaneously complaining to the media about a man shortage. Riker believes this makes traditional pairing much harder to achieve, but all the more necessary if we want to avoid total societal collapse.
Riker's concluding philosophical argument is profound in its simplicity. He states that the fatal flaw of second-wave feminism was the arrogant assumption that men and women fundamentally desire the exact same things in life.
Right.
His evolutionary view is that they emphatically do not. Men are biologically hardwired to build empires, and women are biologically hardwired to build nests. By forcing both sexes into the exact same sterilized corporate matrix, we haven't achieved liberation. We've just made everyone utterly miserable. The tradwife movement isn't brainwashing. It is simply women logically opting out of a rigged marketplace and optimizing their lives for their hardwired instincts.
Wow, okay. We have covered an absolutely immense amount of ground today, and I want to try to quickly summarize this massive, complex journey. We started with Riker's survival paradox, the argument that the vital biological instincts driving male physical risk-taking and heroism are being actively penalized by bureaucratic entities like OSHA.
Yeah.
We then looked at how ancient relational aggression has been modernized and weaponized by corporate HR departments to exile competent men through vibe checks and truth bonds. We waded into the woke campus, exploring the terrifying parallels between modern critical theory and Soviet Lysenkoism, where objective evidence is discarded for ideological purity.
We covered a lot.
We dove deep into the biological battleground of modern dating, tracking how hormonal cycles and BPD traits are leveraged in a legal system that relies on the emotional credibility of female tears. And finally, we explored the massive tradwife pushback against the feminist industrial complex and the economics of the fiscal matriarchy.
It is a breathtakingly comprehensive, undeniably controversial worldview. Regardless of whether you agree with his conclusions, Riker successfully forces the reader to confront the deep evolutionary mechanics operating beneath the surface of our modern institutional policies.
Absolutely. It makes you look at every HR email and every news headline completely differently. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering, and highly provocative thought inspired directly by Riker's text.
What's the thought?
In his closing chapter, Riker points to the records of the U.S. Patent Office. He notes that 98.2% of all registered inventions from the year 1790 to 1900 came exclusively from men, including the foundational advancements in metallurgy, thermodynamics, and the electrical grid that make modern life possible. If our society continues on its current trajectory, if we continue to heavily penalize the biological drive for male risk-taking, hyper-focus, and hierarchy, if we continue to label the very essence of masculinity as toxic, demanding quiet procedural compliance instead of heroic disruptive action, are we simply coasting on the dying fumes of an engine that we are actively, deliberately trying to dismantle? What happens to the infrastructure of civilization when the builders finally realize they are despised by the people living in the house and simply decide to put down their tools?
That is a chilling question, and one that certainly lingers long after you close the book.
Indeed it does. Thank you for joining us on this massive exploration. Before you go, please don't forget to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy this fascinating, ultra-long, and incredibly incisive ebook, Microaggressions by Conrad Riker. You also need to follow him at Conrad Riker on Substack to keep up with his research. And finally, please remind yourselves to like and subscribe to our show so you never miss a deep dive. Stay curious, stay informed, and until next time.